Story 1. I work at McDonald's in Times Square, New York. It's a chaotic place, full of tourists and grumpy people, but I've gotten used to it. Or I thought I had gotten used to it. That Friday started like any other. Rush, wrong orders, children screaming, and me at the register, trying to stay calm. But around 2 in the afternoon, a woman walked in and immediately caught my attention. She was dressed all in black, with a long coat that seemed too heavy for the mild weather. Her manner was strange. She seemed irritated before she even opened her mouth. When she arrived at my register, she was already shouting that her order was wrong, even though she hadn't ordered anything yet. I tried to explain that maybe she was confused, but that only made things worse. She started cursing me, saying that I was incompetent, that people like me shouldn't be there. The manager was busy and no one seemed to notice the shack. Then, out of nowhere, she threw the soda she was holding towards me. He grabbed my uniform and my face. It was humiliating. Before I could react, she leaned over the counter and slapped me. Everyone stopped and looked, but no one did anything. It was only when the manager finally showed up that she walked away as if nothing had happened. After the incident, I was shaking for hours. The manager apologized, but made it clear that the woman had already left and did not want to call the police to avoid drama. I tried to follow the shift, but something about that woman stuck in my head. It wasn't just the aggression. It was the look in her eyes. When she left, she looked at me over her shoulder, and I swear I felt a chill. Felt like she knew something I didn't, like she was challenging me. I left work that day feeling horrible, but I thought it was just stress. I took the subway to the Bronx, where I live, and that's when things started to get weird. First, the train was stopped between stations for almost 40 minutes, which never happens on that line. When I finally arrived at my station, I realized that my phone had a dead battery, even though I had charged it before leaving work. I walked home and, while crossing a street, I tripped over something and fell badly, hurting my knee. When I looked back to see what it was, there was nothing. I arrived home exhausted and still a little disturbed by what had happened at work. My roommate, Rachel, was in the room, but I didn't want to talk. I just wanted to take a shower and forget everything. In the shower, as the water ran, I noticed that the bruise on my knee looked worse than I remembered. There was a small cut, but around it, the skin was turning purple, as if it were a bruise that appeared too quickly. I ignored it and went to sleep. That night, I woke up with a strange feeling. I don't know how to explain it, but it was as if someone was watching me. I opened my eyes and saw that my bedroom door was ajar. I'm pretty sure I closed it before going to bed. I got up and looked through the crack, thinking it was Rachel, but the room was empty. Even so, I smelled a very strong smell, like sulfur. I thought it might be something burning, but nothing was out of place. I closed the door and crawled under the blanket, trying to ignore my racing heart. The next day, things only got worse. When I woke up, I realized that my alarm hadn't gone off. I was almost an hour late for work. I ran to get ready, but it seemed like everything was against me. The shower wouldn't heat up, my uniform was still wet from when I washed off the soda, and, worst of all, my knee hurt so much I could barely walk straight. When I finally left the house, I saw that my subway card was missing. I searched the bag and the apartment, but I couldn't find it. I had to take a taxi, spending what was left of my money for the week. I arrived at work late, and the place was even more chaotic than the day before. My boss was furious, but what caught my attention was one detail. One of the employees mentioned that a woman had stopped by asking for me. According to him, she was wearing a black coat, just like the client from the previous day. My heart raced. Why would she come back? And how did you know my name? The rest of the day at work was a nightmare. Everything that could go wrong did. My checkout station kept crashing, customers were more impatient than ever, and I even dropped a tray full of nuggets on the floor, which almost cost me my job. Every second, I felt a strange tension, as if I were being watched. The woman in the black coat didn't appear again, but every time the restaurant door opened, I froze, waiting to see her enter. At the end of the shift, I went to the closet to get my things and noticed something that made me freeze. My bag was open, and inside it there was a photo. It was a Polaroid, one of those old ones, and it showed my work desk at home. The same table that is in my room. The problem is, I never took that photo. I had no idea how it got in my bag or who could have done it. My heart was beating so hard it felt like it was going to come out of my chest. I threw the photo back in my bag and got out of there as quickly as I could. Returning home that night was agonizing. Every step I took seemed to echo louder than usual. The city was busy, but at the same time, I felt alone, as if everything around me was disconnected from me. When I arrived at the building, I noticed that the apartment door was ajar. Rachel always locked the door, so this didn't make sense. I walked in slowly, calling out to her, but there was no response. Everything seemed normal until I entered my room. The first thing I saw was my table, the same as the photo. Only now, in the center of it, there was a small rag doll. It wasn't mine, and I had never seen it before. It looked handmade, with clumsy stitching and a black dress, just like the woman's coat. In place of the face, there was only a line sewn in the shape of a smile. It was so disturbing that my breath caught. I tried calling Rachel, but the phone was still dead. I took the doll and threw it in the trash, but the discomfort continued. I tried to ignore the feeling that something was wrong, but I couldn't sleep. It was as if the room was colder, even though all the windows were closed. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like someone was standing next to the bed, but when I opened them, there was nothing there. At 3 in the morning, I heard a noise in the room. It was like a drag, something light but constant. I got up slowly and opened the bedroom door. The light in the room was off, but I saw a shadow moving near the table. I turned on the light and almost screamed. The rag doll was back, this time sitting on the edge of the table, her stitched smile facing me directly. I was sure I threw it in the trash. My hands shook as I grabbed a plastic bag, stuffed the doll inside, and ran downstairs to the building's trash can. I threw it so hard I heard the bag rip. I climbed back up, trying to convince myself that it was just someone trying to scare me, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. When I got back to the apartment, the door was ajar again, just like when I got home from work. My heart was racing, and for a second, I thought about calling the police, but what was I going to say? That a doll followed me home? I entered carefully, looking at every corner. Everything seemed normal except for one thing. My room was cold, as if the air conditioning had been left on all day. But I didn't have air conditioning. I lay in bed, trying to ignore the cold and fear. I wanted to sleep, but the noises returned. First, light footsteps in the hallway. Then, the same dragging sound that I heard before, only closer. My body locked up. I didn't have the courage to move. That's when I heard a low, hoarse laugh, as if coming from the back of the room. I closed my eyes and stayed like that until the sun came up, because I knew that if I looked, I would see something I would never forget. The next morning, I felt a mix of exhausted and paranoid. Daylight should have given me some relief, but it didn't. Rachel returned home later, saying she had slept over at her boyfriend's house, but didn't seem to notice anything strange. I thought about telling her, but I knew it would sound crazy. Basically, I thought it was better not to involve anyone else. I grabbed my bag to leave, and that's when I saw another Polaroid. This time, it was a photo of the living room, taken from inside the apartment. This photo made something in me break. I was shaking, and all I could think about was getting out of there. I decided not to go to work and instead went straight to my mom's house in Queens. I spent the day there, trying to understand what was happening. She asked me why I was so quiet, but I made up an excuse. I didn't want to scare her or have to explain something that even I didn't understand. However, while I was there, I received a message from my manager. He said the woman in the black coat came back and asked to speak to me again. That night, I lay on the couch in my mother's living room, thinking it would be safe away from my apartment. But once again, I woke up at 3 in the morning. It was always at this time. The smell of sulfur returned, stronger than ever. I stood still for a few minutes, hearing heavy footsteps coming from the kitchen. My mom and brother were asleep, so who else could be walking around the house? When I found the courage to look, I saw that the kitchen door was open and something was inside. It wasn't human. He was tall, stooped, with arms that were too long and a head that almost reached the ceiling. He was standing still, looking at me, but he didn't have eyes, just two dark cavities that seemed to suck in the light around him. I couldn't move or scream. He slowly raised an arm and pointed at me, and at that moment, I felt like all the air had left my body. I closed my eyes, hoping it would disappear. When I opened it, the kitchen was empty. I ran to my mother's room, desperate, trying to wake her up. She said I must be dreaming, but it wasn't a dream. My body was still shaking, and the smell of sulfur seemed to permeate my clothes. I didn't go back to the couch. I stayed up in her room until dawn, praying it wouldn't come back. The next morning, I decided I couldn't go on like this. I went to my apartment to get my things and move into my mom's house for a while. As soon as I entered the building, I noticed something strange. The doorman, who was always there, didn't show up. The feeling of emptiness was suffocating. When I opened the door to my apartment, my heart almost stopped. The doll was there, sitting in the middle of the living room rug, with that stitched smile even wider, as if it was mocking me. I ran away without looking back, leaving everything. I didn't go back to the apartment, not even to get my things. I had someone empty the place for me because I knew I couldn't set foot there again. Since then, little things still happen. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and smell that sulfur, or find objects out of place. Nothing as direct as before, but enough to remind me that it's still around. To this day, I don't know who that woman was or what really happened. I've thought about seeking help, but I'm afraid of messing with something I don't understand. I just know that my life was never the same after that day at McDonald's. And every time I see someone in a black coat, my stomach drops, as if that could start all over again. If you like our stories, leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. Story 2. I have worked for almost 8 years as a training manager at the McDonald's. I have trained hundreds of employees over the years, and I can say that I know every detail of this unit like the back of my hand. From the specific arrangement of equipment to the small peculiarities of our internal system. So, when something is out of the ordinary, I notice it right away. And that's exactly what happened when Mike Thompson showed up for his first day of training. What started to bother me was nothing very obvious at first. Mike was a guy in his 20s, quiet, efficient, nothing that attracted attention at first glance. But on the first day, he knew details that I hadn't even mentioned yet. He knew exactly where the specific circuit breaker that always caused problems in the kitchen was located. He knew the secret code to the warehouse that only longtime employees knew, and he even casually mentioned the crack hidden behind the freezer, something only the veteran staff knew about. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was just coincidences. Maybe he had worked in another unit before. But the more I watched, the stranger his behavior became. During a break, I decided to search the system for Mike's background, something I should have done before. That's when I got the first shock. There was no previous record of him at any McDonald's location. Intrigued, I decided to do a more detailed search. Early in the evening, When I was organizing some old files in the office, I found a folder from 2016 with files of terminated employees. My heart almost stopped when I saw a black and white photo stapled to one of the files. It was of a Michael Thompson, who had worked there between 2015 and 2016, and mysteriously disappeared after his last shift. The most disturbing, the resemblance to our new employee was uncanny. That same night, as I closed the restaurant, I started to notice other strange things. Mike was cleaning the kitchen, and I could have sworn I saw him mumble something as he stared at the exact spot where, according to the old reports I just read, he had last been seen in 2016. The way he moved around the kitchen was identical to what was described in the reports on the original Michael. Always following the same movement pattern, always checking the same specific points. It was like watching a replay of something that happened years ago. My skin crawled every time he walked by me. The situation got even stranger when Sarah, our longest-serving employee, arrived for the next morning shift. She has worked here since 2014 and was there when the first Michael disappeared. As soon as he saw the new Mike, his face turned pale as paper. She pulled me into the storage room and, with shaking hands, told me that she was the one who found the original Michael's uniform, neatly folded next to the freezer the morning after he disappeared. What disturbed me even more was when she mentioned a detail that wasn't in the reports. The original Michael had a small scar on his right hand, the result of a fryer accident. When I looked at the new Mike that morning, there was the same scar in the exact same place. That afternoon, I decided to discreetly confront him during his break. I called Mike into the office for a chat, determined to understand what was going on. When I started asking questions about his past and previous experiences, he kept that same serene smile, answering everything in a vague and imprecise way. But the moment that really made me freeze was when I accidentally dropped a cup of coffee. Before the liquid even touched the floor, Mike had already turned around and reached toward the closet where we kept cleaning supplies. A closet he supposedly shouldn't have known existed, since we had changed its location after the 2017 renovation. The turning point came when I decided to stay late that night, pretending I was doing administrative work. I actually wanted to watch Mike during his last shift. Around 11 p.m., while the night crew was doing the final cleaning, I saw him entering the warehouse. I waited a few minutes and followed him silently. When I opened the door, the temperature seemed to have dropped by about 10 degrees. Mike was standing in front of the same freezer where his uniform had been found years ago, completely still. The scariest thing was that he was murmuring something in a voice that no longer sounded like his own. It was deeper, older somehow. I could make out words like, "always here" and "never left." I stood frozen in the doorway, trying to process what was happening. That's when Mike slowly turned towards me. His face was different. It was still him, but at the same time it wasn't. It was as if I was seeing two people superimposed, current Mike and old photos of Michael that I had seen in the archives. His eyes had a strange glow, almost phosphorescent in the dim light of the warehouse. He smiled a smile that made my blood run cold and said, "You know I belong here, Richard. I always have." The way he said my name, it sounded like it was being said by several voices at once. I remember taking a step back, my back hitting the storage room door. At this moment, the lights began to flash violently. The noise from the freezers grew louder, almost deafening, and the air became so thick it was difficult to breathe. Mike started walking towards me, but his movements were wrong, as if he was moving in slow motion underwater. With every step he took, I could see his appearance changing subtly. Sometimes he looked like current Mike, sometimes like 2016 Michael, like a distorted image. I could smell old fried food and something rotten that seemed to be emanating from it, even though I knew we had just cleaned the entire restaurant. Panic took over me when I realized that the door behind me was no longer opening. I tried to scream for help, but my voice just wouldn't come out. Mike kept approaching, that horrible smile still on his face, as he repeated, "I never left here, Richard. This place is mine." Suddenly, all the lights in the warehouse went out at once. In the total darkness, I could hear his heavy breathing getting closer and closer. When the lights came back on seconds later, he was gone. There was no one else in the warehouse other than me. The temperature returned to normal instantly, and the door finally opened when I turned the handle. I ran into the main area of the restaurant, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. The rest of the team was there, acting normal as if nothing had happened. When I asked about Mike, everyone looked at me confused. Nancy, the night shift supervisor, said there was no Mike working that night. I rushed back to the office and frantically searched for his admission form. I was sure I had filled it out the week before, but there was nothing, neither in the system nor in physical folders. It was as if Mike Thompson had never existed. The only record I found was the old record from 2016, with that same black and white photo of the original Michael. In the following days, I tried to rationalize everything that happened. Maybe the stress of work had affected me more than I realized. But Sarah also remembered him. She was the only one besides me. She resigned 2 days later, saying she could no longer work there. The most disturbing thing is that, since that night, strange things started to happen in the restaurant. Equipment turns on by itself in the early hours of the morning. Objects move around without explanation, and sometimes, when I'm closing the restaurant, I can swear I see someone wearing a uniform standing near the freezer in the reflection of the windows. Every time I turn to look, there's no one there, but the smell of old frying and that feeling of rot always remain. It's been a month since that night, and things have only gotten worse. Night shift employees have started reporting strange sounds coming from the warehouse, as if someone is dragging heavy equipment, even when no one is there. Security cameras often capture unexplained distortions near the freezer, such as a human figure moving quickly across the screen. Last week, during a routine inspection, we discovered something disturbing behind that same freezer. When we moved it to check the old crack, we found a small metal door embedded in the wall, completely welded shut. No plans of the building showed its existence. The most disturbing thing was finding, engraved on the surface of the door, the initials MT and the date June 11th, 2016, the exact day of the first Michael's disappearance. Last night, as I was doing the closing myself, I clearly heard Mike's voice coming over the restaurant's sound system. That same distorted, overlapping voice I heard in the warehouse. The message was short, but it chilled my spine. "Coming soon, Richard. You will all see that this place has always been my home." This morning, when I arrived to open the restaurant, I found all of the staff uniforms neatly folded next to the freezer, just like the original Michael's uniform was found years ago. And on the mirror in the staff bathroom, written in what looked like old frying grease, was the message: "I was never truly absent. Now it's time for you all to belong too." I'm writing this because I know this will be my last week here. I resigned earlier today, but something tells me that, just like Mike/Michael, a part of me will never truly leave this place. And sometimes, when I look at my reflection in restaurant windows, I'm not sure if the person looking back at me is still me. If you like our stories, leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. Story 3. I never imagined that my job at McDonald's would turn into the scariest episode of my life. It was a particularly busy Tuesday. I arrived at 6 a.m. to do a stock count, as I always do on Tuesdays. Right away, I realized something was wrong. The boxes of frozen hamburgers, which are always organized by expiration date on the first shelf of the freezer, were all messed up, and some even appeared lying on the floor. My first thought was that Josh on the night shift had messed up. He's young and sometimes he gets messed up. But when I looked at the schedule, I saw that he hadn't even worked the night before. In fact, no one on the night shift had touched the freezer. That started to give me butterflies that had nothing to do with the temperature of the place. I decided to check the security cameras to understand what had happened during the night. I sat in the small monitoring room, the same one where I spend hours doing stock reports, and started looking back at the images. Around 2 a.m., I noticed a strange movement in the corner of the screen. At first I thought it was interference, But then I saw it clearly. A shadow moving across the warehouse, as if floating between the shelves. The most bizarre thing is that the doors remained closed the entire time. I checked and rechecked the recordings of the entrances several times. No one had entered or left the warehouse that night. My hands started to shake as I watched that thing move through the warehouse. It was impossible to distinguish a defined shape. It was like a dark spot that distorted the surrounding image. And every time this thing passed near the boxes, they moved by themselves, as if someone was pushing them. I thought about showing it to my manager, Mark, but he's one of those super skeptical guys who always scoffs when anyone mentions anything supernatural. Besides, what explanation would I give? Hey, there's a ghost messing with our stash? He would probably tell me to take a few days off, thinking I was too stressed. I spent the whole morning tense, jumping at every noise. Every time I had to go to the warehouse, my heart would race. The worst thing is that things continued to happen throughout the day. Suddenly, I would hear the sound of boxes falling into the freezer, and when I went to check, I found everything out of place, and there was no one around. At one specific moment, I was organizing some boxes of nuggets when I felt an abnormal cold, much more intense than the freezer's normal temperature. It was as if something had passed right behind me. When I turned around, I swear I saw that same camera shadow moving quickly behind a shelf. I tried to convince myself that it was just tiredness, that maybe I really needed to take a few days off. But then something happened that made me realize I wasn't imagining things. During the lunch rush, I went to get more supplies from storage, and when I opened the freezer door, all the lights blinked at once. In the reflection of the metal of the shelves, I clearly saw a dark figure standing behind me. It wasn't a shadow this time, it was human in shape, but it was as if it was made of black smoke. I stood paralyzed, feeling that absurd cold envelop me. The air became so thick I could barely breathe. I have never felt so scared in my life. I don't really remember how I managed to get out of the freezer. I just know that I ran out as fast as I could, bumping into Amy from the kitchen on the way. She realized something was wrong and kept asking me what happened, but I couldn't speak. My voice just wouldn't come out. I sat in the staff room for about 20 minutes trying to calm down, my hands shaking so much that I couldn't even hold my cell phone properly. The worst thing is that I started to remember several strange things that I had ignored in the last few weeks. The inexplicable smell of burning flesh that appeared out of nowhere, the tools that disappeared and reappeared in different places, that sound of heavy footsteps that we sometimes heard when the restaurant was already closed. After composing myself a little, I needed to go back to the warehouse. We were in the middle of the working day and I couldn't just abandon my work. I asked Amy to go with me, but when we got there, we found a scene that chilled my soul. All the boxes in the freezer were stacked in the center, forming a kind of tower that reached almost to the ceiling. It was impossible for someone to have done that in such a short time, especially considering the weight of the boxes. And on top of the pile, balanced perfectly, was the clipboard with my inventory control list, the same one I had left lying on the floor when I ran out. That scene was too much for me. I left work early claiming I was feeling ill, and I really was. On the way home, I Googled the history of that McDonald's and discovered something disturbing. In 1989, a night shift employee died in an accident at the warehouse. Apparently, he was trapped in the freezer for hours when the door got stuck. His name was Robert Miller, and from what I read in the old news, he was in charge of inventory just like me. The scary thing is that, according to comments on a local forum, Other people who have worked there over the years have reported similar experiences to mine. I didn't sleep at all that night. I tossed and turned in bed, thinking about all the details. I remembered that I always felt that strange cold near the freezer door, even when it was turned off for maintenance. And several times he had found the stock control clipboard in different places from where he had left it, always with frozen finger marks on the pages. I started to put the pieces together. Events were always most intense on Tuesdays, exactly the day of the week that Robert died. I decided to look for more information and ended up finding an old photo of the restaurant's employees. When I saw Robert's image, my blood ran cold. It was exactly the shape I had seen in the freezer's reflection. I spent another week working there, trying to hold on, but things only got worse. Events started to happen more frequently, not just on Tuesdays. At various times, when I was alone in the warehouse, I heard heavy breathing right next to my ear. The boxes moved in front of me without any explanation. One time, all the freezer doors suddenly closed while I was inside, and I was only able to get out because Amy heard my screams. At that moment, I realized that I could no longer stay there. The feeling was that that presence was becoming more and more aggressive, as if it wanted me to go through the same thing as Robert. I quit my job last week and got a job at a department store on the other side of town. I never went back to that McDonald's, not even as a customer. I still have nightmares about that dark figure and wake up in the middle of the night feeling that horrible cold from the freezer. The most disturbing thing is that on my last day, when I went to get my things from the staff locker, I found an old photo folded inside my coat. It was the same photo from 1989 that I had seen online with Robert and the other employees. I have no idea how it got there, and honestly, I don't want to know. I just know that I will never be able to enter an industrial freezer again without feeling that paralyzing fear and remembering the shadow that watched me between the shelves.